Hello, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Grand Rounds. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started momentarily. Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining us. And before we get started with today's rounds, which I am thoroughly looking forward to, I just want to start with a few announcements. So first of all, I would like you to join me in congratulating Dr. Jean Marie Bradford, our newest member of the Virginia APGAR Academy for Medical Educators. The Virginia APGAR Academy is an active community of educators at VPNS dedicated to promoting, rewarding, and supporting outstanding education for its medical students, residents, fellows, and faculty. Membership in the Academy represents not only recognition of excellence as an educator, but also a commitment to contributing to the educational life of this medical community. So congratulations again, Dr. Bradford. Also just wanted to make a plug for the Department of Psychiatry annual meeting, which is going to be Wednesday, June 8th. So that is coming up from 11 to 12. And this year's annual meeting will be hybrid via Zoom and in person. So more details to follow there, but just put that in your calendars. Speaking of hybrid, next week's Grand Rounds, we are going to have our first hybrid rounds with our own Dr. Suzette Evans, who is Professor of Clinical Psychiatry here. And just to remind you all, the hybrid format is going to allow for in-person masked attendance, socially distanced, in the auditorium, as well as a simul broadcast via Zoom for those who wish to view remotely. And we're really looking forward to resuming the option of in-person rounds. We look forward to seeing as many of you as possible. So please watch out for the announcements in the upcoming week as those rounds approach. And before I turn it over to Dr. Laura Mufson, who's going to introduce our round speaker today, just want to remind everybody that we really encourage everyone to post questions during the talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the window, not the chat. If you are a trainee, please put the word trainee at the beginning of your question so that we can prioritize those. And then finally, as some of you will have seen in more recent rounds, we have the option now of asking your question in person. And if you would like to do that at the end of your question in the Q&A, please write, "Can ask the question myself," or "prefer to have my question read." And then that will let us know whether or not we're going to promote you temporarily to as co-host, and you can turn on your camera and then speak directly to Dr. Calzada and ask your question. We really hope that you consider doing that, as that really, I think, adds to the interactivity and our sense of connection during these Zoom rounds. And then lastly, we've also begun compiling a list of potential speakers for the upcoming academic year. We really are hoping to have a diverse list of speakers, cover basic and clinical topics as well as education. And so if you can fill out our survey, Simon is going to place that link in the chat. With any suggestions for speakers, that would be greatly appreciated. The survey link is constantly monitored throughout the year. So as if you think of somebody, you can find the link and enter your nomination. As always, it's always great for us to have folks that you've seen before, and we know that are good speakers. But we definitely value the input of our department members, and thank you in advance for that. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mufson.
Great, thank you, Kate. Welcome everybody to the Viola Bernard Grand Rounds today. Before I speak about Dr. Calzada, our speaker, I just want to provide a little background on Dr. Bernard herself. She was a prominent New York psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who was on the faculty here at Columbia for 5 decades. And through her professional life, she worked to tackle the social problems that she saw negatively impacting mental health. She was committed to understanding the needs and problems of children who were suffering due to poverty or other social and community factors, and to increasing access to mental health care for children and families living in communities that were historically marginalized and underserved. And the Division of Child Psychiatry was very fortunate. In 2016, the Viola Bernard Foundation made a generous gift to establish the endowment fund in her name, which supports this yearly Grand Rounds presentation. as well as opportunities for clinicians to get training in empirically supported treatments for children and families. So today it's an honor for me to welcome Dr. Esther Calzada as our Viola Bernard Grand Round speaker. As she and I were reminiscing just a few minutes ago, I remember Esther from internship recruitment. Unfortunately, she chose not to come to Columbia, but I've been following her career ever since. And as you'll hear, Dr. Calzada embodies the same commitment to ensure that minoritized communities have access to culturally and evidence-informed interventions and support for healthy development. Dr. Calzada is currently the Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion and the Norma and Clay Leben, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, Professor in Child and Family Behavioral Health at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work. She received her BA from Duke University and her PhD from the University of Florida, where she completed her dissertation in clinical child psychology under the mentorship of Dr. Sheila Iberg, who will be very familiar to many of our clinical psychologists in the audience. Dr. Iberg was the developer of parent-child interaction therapy, which is an intervention that we implement widely in our outpatient behavioral health services. And Dr. Calzada adapted PCIT for working with Dominican and Puerto Rican mothers for her dissertation research. She was then on the faculty at NYU for many years, at least 10, developing her research program and working with somebody else that we know at Columbia, Dr. Lori Miller-Brotman, on the development and study of Parent Core, which is a scalable, family-centered, empirically supported program for low-income families of color, which is delivered in pre-K programs. And Dr. Calzada continues this work and is currently engaged in a large multi-year effort to implement Parent Core in Texas. Dr. Calzada's own scholarship focuses on minoritized populations, particularly Latinx families who face intersecting forms of marginalization and oppression. She's received funding from the National Institute of Health, the U.S. Department of Education, and the National Science Foundation. And her work advances the understanding of unique risk factors, acculturative stress, experiences of discrimination that undermine healthy development among Latinos, as well as the protective and promoting factors such as strong ethnic identity, family cohesion that offset such risks. And her work aims to identify mechanisms within homes and schools that shape mental health and achievement. Ultimately, her goal is to incorporate influences of culture and context into evidence-informed interventions to better support Latinx families and other families of color. In addition to her research, teaching, administrative activities, Dr. Calzada also serves as associate editor for the Journal of Latinx Psychology and the Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology. And we are extremely eager to hear your talk today. And the title is Looking in All the Wrong Places, Rethinking Our Approach to Supporting Mental Health and Academic Achievement Among Latinx Children in Marginalized Communities. And I turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mufson, for that introduction. And thank you for the invitation to be here. I appreciate everyone coming to engage in this conversation with me about issues that I feel very passionately about. So I want to start by just stating my positionality, and so that you understand a little bit about who I am from a more personal perspective, because I truly believe that who we are informs who we are as people, informs who we are as scholars. So I grew up and identify as somebody who is bicultural and bilingual. My parents are immigrants from the Dominican Republic, and so I grew up speaking Spanglish at home. My parents only spoke Spanish. And outside of the home, I grew up in a very white city and in white schools. And so I considered myself and certainly thought that I was viewed and treated as white. And because I was born in the US, I was English speaking at school. So in a lot of ways that kind of created this identity that I come to think of a little bit as an invisible minority, which has a host of issues around my own sense of self, but also how other people see me. And so because I was bicultural and because I was US born and English speaking, then I kind of felt like I often passed, right, for being white. Although I also, over the years, have very often gotten the question, what are you? Kind of referring to this look that I have that isn't quite white. I also grew up with and continue to have a lot of privilege. I'm light-skinned, I'm financially secure, to name a couple of my privileges, and I attended predominantly white institutions throughout my life, and including kind of where I am now. And so, in other words, I really, from the time that I was born, I was very much steeped in whiteness and socialized in whiteness. And that's something that I've come to understand as being very important to my scholarship. I also want to say a little bit about how my personal lived experience and experiences and understanding. I believe that these are intertwined. So the first is, sorry, I'm having, okay, hopefully that's working. The first is, as Dr. Muffson mentioned, is that I trained under Dr. Sheila Iberg in parent-child interaction therapy. This was completely foundational for me as a scholar, as a researcher. Dr. Iberg is amazing. And certainly that was a very specific worldview, right, around parenting and families and how to support parents in raising healthy children, and specifically in addressing mental health disorders and behavior disorders in early childhood. And I remember in graduate school, this was before I became a mother, a lot of conversations around how we didn't have to be parents in order to understand and support parents. And I believe that to be the case. And when I became a mother, I understood parenting in a completely different way than I ever had before, in a very humbling experience to be a parent. So navigating motherhood, navigating parenthood in general, can be very humbling and teach you all the things that you really don't know, regardless of how many books you read or how much advice you get from professionals or from others. I also want to name that another really impactful personal experience was moving abroad. I moved abroad with my husband and 3 children to Mexico City for a couple of years. And as somebody who had been working with Latinx families and working to understand the experience of immigration, and had myself been daughter of immigrants, living through that day-to-day experience of navigating and coping with a culture that, while somewhat familiar, because I myself am Latina, was in many ways unfamiliar, felt incredibly challenging and stressful and hard. And finally, I want to share that I am the mother of a child with a mental health disorder. One of my children has major depressive disorder, and living through that is incredibly challenging as well, and really does not align very much with what I had learned kind of in graduate school about depression, or at least not that it didn't align, maybe that the experience of that was just so much more complex and nuanced and deep than anything that I could have ever grasped from my graduate training or beyond. And so I name all of these things because I had come to understand, both probably implicitly, but maybe even a little explicitly, that as a clinical child psychologist, my job was to really understand kind of science and share science. And that my personal experiences, my lived experiences didn't really have much of a role for me as a professional. And I want to challenge that narrative. I don't believe that that's true. I believe that I understand things much more holistically, in much more nuanced ways when I draw on my lived experiences as well. So those are the things that I'm kind of bringing to my, my scholarship that I'm going to share with you today. So the foundation of all of this, right, from a scholar perspective, is parent training, like I mentioned before. And I have always understood parent training to be kind of the gold standard approach to so many different child mental health disorders. And in the case of my own training, specifically with disruptive behavior disorders, including ODD, CD, and ADHD. Parent training programs emerged in the 1970s. They're grounded in attachment and social learning theories, as most of y'all likely already know. And again, this was something that I almost took as sacrosanct, right? That we support parents and we train parents. I think it's really interesting to pay attention to the language here. We train parents on how to better support their kids. But as I was going through graduate school and learning about this evidence-based approach to supporting families, I also started to kind of lean into my own personal ethnic, cultural background and identity, and to notice the disconnect between what I was learning and what I was seeing in the literature with my culture and my people. So I adopted a set of commitments, I think starting in graduate school, although those have certainly evolved in many ways, and maybe I have more clarity on them. But my commitments and what I'm going to share with you today are some thoughts about three main issues. One is I had a commitment to challenge our stereotypical notions of Latinx parenting. And Latinx is a relatively new term, so that's not what I was calling it back then, but you know, to challenge kind of what was being said about how parents raise their kids when they're part of the Latino population, Latinx population. The second was to challenge stereotypical notions of Latinx children and youth. And the third was to inform prevention and early intervention efforts. And so I'll say quickly here that after leaving graduate school, I entered a position that allowed me to actually focus much more on prevention rather than clinical intervention. Okay, so I'm going to talk kind of big picture about these issues, but I want to just share where the data is coming from that I'm going to be referencing throughout the talk today. And this is a series of studies that, that I have been involved with over time. The first 5 that are kind of in that pinkish color are studies that I have led. The first 2 are from New York City, and the one is from the Dominican Republic. Data collection occurred in the Dominican Republic, and the final 2 are in Texas, where I am now. And all of the ones that I've led have been very explicitly focused on Latinx families, of course, but families of young children. So sometimes starting as early as 3, always involving kind of that preschool year, and sometimes as old as kindergartners. But I will be talking a little bit about some data from a project called Caminos that is led by PI Katie Roche at George Washington University. And I highlight that because that work is with families of early adolescents, also Latinx though. And that data collection actually is in Georgia, in the Atlanta area. And finally, I am going to be drawing on a little bit on qualitative work on some focus group data and kind of a case study of sorts with a young adult who identifies as Mexican-American, who's named Enrique. And so I'm not going to give lots of details about methods, although I'm happy to answer questions about that. But I just wanted to give you a sense of where this data is coming from as I allude to different findings. And what kind of unites all of these studies is that I've really worked to collect data that will allow me to really kind of shift our approach to the study of Latinx children so that we can develop more culturally informed frameworks. Okay, so I will start with this commitment to challenging the stereotype of Latinx parenting. And, you know, in my read of the literature, and certainly in conversations that I had about Latino parents, it was very clear that folks understood parents from Latino cultures to be controlling, certainly strict, but also harsh. There was a lot of kind of reference to the chancla that I bet lots of folks on this in this grand rounds are familiar with, which was that chancla is just a slipper, a flip-flop, and essentially it's the idea, right, that Latinx parents use the chancla to threaten and to even actually discipline, right, their kids through physical punishment. And so this was the depiction of parents, even in the literature. I think it aligns very much with how we tend to see Latinx populations in this country. We are often stereotyped as being loud and emotional, as being erotic, and we're described as being foreign, being illegal, being alien. We're thought of as criminal or gang involved or just domestic workers. And so all of these narratives really kind of come together and certainly shape the way that we see parents as well. Now, I have to say that even, back then when I was kind of paying attention to, one, the very limited literature on Latinx parenting, but two, a relatively negative depiction of Latinx parents, there was also part of that depiction that kind of resonated with me. My parents were very strict. They did not rely on physical punishment, but they were incredibly strict in what I would call, or certainly I experienced as an adolescent, as being quite controlling. And focus group data that I collected certainly also spoke to the fact that Latinx parenting was very different from Westernized parenting. So here you see some quotes from moms in a study where I was just asking, what do you think about parenting and these parenting practices that we often espouse in our parent training programs? And moms were saying, like, yeah, you have to spank. I don't like this idea of, for example, reward systems. I don't have that option. You're not helping me. I don't want to buy them toys. I'm not giving a timeout. I don't have the time for that. It's wrong to selectively ignore kids for misbehaving. So all of this kind of just spoke to this mismatch between what we were teaching in our parent training programs and how, in this case, moms, Latina moms, felt about parenting. But of course, all of that, and certainly even in that focus group, what was not being captured was the diversity of the Latinx population. And we are an incredibly diverse group of people in this country. And that's true in terms of the countries of origin that we come from, and thus our ethnic identities. It's true in terms of our immigrant status. How did we arrive here? What kinds of rights do we have based on our documentation status? We speak English, we speak Spanish, we speak both, we speak indigenous languages. We are Black, white, brown. So racially, we're very diverse. And we're certainly diverse in terms of socioeconomic indicators and resources and our educational opportunities and things like that. So the diversity of the Latinx population is something that in my read of the literature has been brought up consistently, even if I backtrack to those kind of very early studies on Latino families. More recently, I think there has been more of an emphasis on understanding that diversity through the concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality theory suggests that social position is best understood by considering the intersection of categories of difference. And the importance here, I think, is that we're understanding diversity, but we're understanding it in terms of social hierarchies and therefore power and privileges, right? And so it's one thing to say that some Latinos are Black and some Latinos are brown and some Latinos are white. And it's another thing to say, and that has really deep implications for, how we experience the world, right? And we cannot, of course, separate these aspects of our identity. So designating us as one thing, for example, as a Latinx person, is overly simplistic because we are not just that one thing. We are the totality of all of our different identities. So we can think of that in terms of being really situated at the center of all of these overlapping circles of identity that determine what kinds of privileges do we have, what kinds of oppressions do we have. And when we think of the Latinx population, certainly we could probably add other social identities here, whether we are male or female, whether we're cis or transgendered, whether we live in poverty or live in relative wealth, whether we are Black, brown, or white. All of these things, our documentation status, whether we speak English, are granting us either privileges to navigate this white society and world, or creating barriers and marginalizing and oppressive experiences for that. So intersectionality is a theory that more and more over time I have found myself relying on to really understand more clearly and more deeply what Latinx folks and specifically families of young children are experiencing. So I want to bring that to the question of parenting. And if we go back to this idea that Latinx parenting stereotypically is what we might consider authoritarian, right? So like harsh and controlling and really in some ways kind of stifling of the child's creativity and curiosity and independence, then I think we can say very clearly based on my work, which of course is just relatively modest as part of the literature, and is with young children, which I think is really important because there are some developmental issues to consider here. But I think we want to answer the question, are Latinx parents authoritarian on the whole? Is that true, that kind of depiction of Latinx parenting? And is that more or less true for different kinds of Latinx parents? So here what you see is some data from both New York City and the Dominican Republic, which helps us understand kind of, what might be really culturally normative, because we know that when folks come to a different cultural context, for example, as immigrants, Dominicans coming to the US, everything about their experiences and their beliefs, traditions, values, all of it can shift because of that new cultural context. So we looked at parents in the Dominican Republic as well as parents in New York City. And we also looked at parents who were living in poverty and those who were not living in poverty. And even with all of those considerations, we found very low rates of authoritarian parenting. Now, the big methodological caveat here is that these are self-reported parenting practices. So these are moms telling us how much they endorse or rely on authoritarian parenting practices. What you see in the orange box at the bottom are parenting practices scale, and this was on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 indicating more. And so the means for authoritarian parenting are pretty low. And you see them low across the board, with the exception of our last column, which were parents who were living in poverty in the Dominican Republic, right? So we see a little bit of a trend that maybe authoritarian parenting is a little bit more normative in the DR, and authoritarian parenting is a little bit more normative in the context of poverty. So when you put those two things together, that's when we saw a little bit more endorsement of authoritarian parenting. I will still say that it was relatively low. Authoritative parenting, which in many ways we think of as the optimal parenting approach in our westernized US context, those were actually high across the board. So despite this kind of westernized conceptualization of how we interact with kids, these Dominican moms were saying, whether they lived in the US or in the DR, whether they lived in poverty or not, were saying that this is how they engaged with their children in an authoritative way. So I would say that this is one illustration of, across the studies that I mentioned, of us looking at this question of, are Latinx parents, and moms specifically, I should be saying moms, adopting or relying on an authoritarian parenting style or approach? And I would say the answer is no. And one of the reasons we care, right, is because authoritarian parenting generally is considered a risk factor. So there's plenty of evidence that starting from the 1960s, really, that authoritarian parenting is associated with suboptimal developmental outcomes for kids. And so the question was, is that also true? Or to what extent is that true in Latinx populations? And the literature that had addressed this really was mostly with families of adolescents. And that's relevant because some folks were finding that authoritarian parenting actually was not a risk factor for families of color during the adolescent years. And I think here with when we're thinking about young kids, right, it's very different, because the way that you receive and understand the parenting, changes a lot from the time that you're 4 to the time that you're 14. So across studies, we were finding authoritarian parenting to be a risk factor. And this was kind of regardless of sample and also over time. We found that it was associated with more internalizing problems broadly and also specifically with depression, but also with more externalizing problems and with lower school readiness, or those kind of early academic skills that kids need to learn easily and quickly in school as they make that transition to school, and lower academic achievement test scores as kids got older. So even if authoritarian parenting isn't normative, but it is a risk factor, then we certainly want to understand, why do parents use an authoritarian approach? I think I started to feel pretty comfortable saying it's not because it's just cultural, right? It's not just the way parents parent because they, are Latinx. And one way that we've addressed this question is to look at the family stress model. So this model, for those of you who are not familiar with it, really argues that kind of the stressors that parents face, and primarily financial, is the origins of this model, that those kinds of stressors kind of create an ecology within the home in which parents are stressed, in which there are higher rates of distress, like depression, for example, marital quality declines, social support declines, and all of those things then increase the chance that parenting will be more harsh, more controlling, or however we might conceptualize that, ineffective parenting. And ultimately then, the reason that this impacts kids is because of these contextual factors related to stress. And so we have found some support for that. The original model really was kind of absent considerations of culture. And we have, and other folks also in the field have looked at more kind of cultural stressors as well as what we might consider more universal stressors. And here are just a couple of findings along these lines. So when we think of harsh verbal parenting, we have found that moms who have limited social support from their family do tend to engage in more harsh verbal parenting. We also found actually that moms who are parenting boys tend to be more verbally harsh. And then we found that moms who experience maternal depression, pressure to acculturate, and pressure against acculturation were also more likely to be authoritarian. So the latter two, the pressure to and against acculturation, right, are an example of how we've been working to incorporate cultural variables into our models to better understand Latinx families. And the pressure to acculturate refers to this idea that in order to navigate mainstream culture, right, in order to get a job, for example, or be able to show up to the school where your child is attending and have a meeting with the teacher or with the guidance counselor, those things require, right, that you have a certain level of acculturation. Even in the most kind of linguistically diverse communities, we scarcely find professionals, whether it's in the school system or the healthcare system, who speak the language of the families. And so that pressure to kind of adopt to this new cultural milieu is what that pressure to acculturate signals. But there's also pressure against acculturation. And this is the idea that, for example, folks who within your family or your social network who are very aligned with that Latino culture and those values and traditions and beliefs want you to hold on to them and pressure you to maintain your Spanish and to continue to embody those Latinx cultural values. And so moms are getting it kind of from both ends, right? And that is contributing to stress that increases the chance of authoritarian parenting. We also see that cultural factors matter for understanding maternal depression. This is some data from our moms in Austin, Texas, who, by the way, a third of our sample was reporting clinically significant depressive symptoms. This was not a diagnostic tool, this was the CESD, but these moms are reporting relatively high levels of depressive symptomatology. And if maternal depression, as we know from a lot of a pretty robust literature, is really impactful for kids, right? Because they're so impactful for moms and their own well-being and their ability to parent, then we want to understand how moms, what are some of the factors that are related to maternal depression. And so again, here we see some of those cultural factors playing a big role. And I want to point out that that's not necessarily always in a negative way. So here we see that ethnic identity, moms who had strong ethnic identity, who really felt connected with their Latinx identity, who felt very proud of it, who felt a sense of belonging, those moms were less likely to report being depressed. Okay, so turning to then, further understanding this relationship between context, parenting, and child development, I want to share that, of course, one of the big methodological issues in the literature and in our society, right, is this confound between being a person of color, being a family of color, a population of color, and poverty. And that's all rooted, and there's a lot of evidence, right, that that's all rooted in these histories of oppression that are manifested and expressed even today. And so we have not really been able to tackle this question in very meaningful ways because that confound is very strong, and most of the families that we work with are indeed living in poverty. The exception was that when we went to the Dominican Republic, that we were very easily able to, we were very easily able to recruit not only non-poor mothers, but actually mothers from families who were quite wealthy. And so that allowed us to look at this as poverty basically as a moderator, right, of the relation between authoritarian parenting, and in this case, between that and internalizing problems of kids. And we see that in the context of poverty, we see a much stronger relationship between the parenting and the negative outcome. Another moderator that I want to highlight is coming back to the US, and this is drawing on the study of families in Georgia. So these are Latinx families of early adolescents, that moms who report a very strong anti-immigrant experience based on kind of the rhetoric that they're hearing in their immediate environments, that also has a moderating effect. Now, in this case, parenting was conceptualized as based on the cultural value of respeto. Respeto is about this kind of belief system, right, that and valuing of this hierarchy where kids, youth are expected to be highly respectful and deferential to adults, and not only their parents, but also their extended family members, certainly their elders primarily, but even more general beyond their family. And respeto in the literature has kind of mixed findings about how it relates to, how it kind of plays out within family processes. In some ways, it can really reinforce the idea of being kind of harsh and strict because you are really focused on that, child is submissive idea in some ways. But here what we found, and these are families of early adolescents, like I mentioned, is that respeto is actually protective when families are facing more significant anti-immigrant rhetoric. Okay, so what we can say then, returning to this question of, is authoritarian parenting and kind of harsh parenting and all of that a risk factor? We can say yes, but we also want to kind of go further than that and say that really these contextual pieces are incredibly important. And they're really important because they're also about, when we think about the Latinx population in the US, these are issues that folks are facing, like at the population level. And that includes poverty and xenophobia and a culture of stress. So these contextual pieces really make us want to pay attention to those systemic forces. Okay, before I move off of parenting, I want to say quickly something about the specifically the use of spanking and this idea of the chancla. And this is data from New York City. And we're showing here that Latina mothers actually do not rely necessarily very much on physical punishment or on spanking, at least not more than the general population of parents of young children. So we know in the US very generally, the use of spanking is pretty common in those kind of early childhood years, 3, 4-ish, and that was true for these moms as well. So they reported that they would spank sometimes, right? And we didn't see any ethnic differences there. We did see that boys were more likely to get spanked than girls, at least according to Mom Report. And we also saw this very normative decrease that we see with the general population in the reliance on spanking. So by the time kids are 5, 6, certainly 7, it is very infrequent that parents rely on spanking, and we were seeing that trend here too. And importantly, we were also seeing that spanking actually was not a predictor of externalizing behavior. And so we did see that spanking was concurrently associated with acting out. And so we can think about that bidirectional influence between parents and kids, but we were not seeing that if kids had been spanked at an earlier time in their lives, that would actually predict acting out behavior later. So the reason I kind of talk about spanking very specifically is because there is a movement to ban spanking. And, I want to kind of go on record that I do not agree with that. And here's why. I certainly agree that we want to discourage and certainly not accept any form of violence towards kids. This is something we need to question. There are great ethical kind of considerations behind that question. But we just don't have the research to tell us that spanking used in this normative, relatively infrequent way is harmful for kids. And at the same time, when we work to ban spanking, for example, by having the American Pediatrics Association or APA, American Psychological Association, talk about banning spanking, what we're doing is we're reinforcing this idea that these parents are criminal. And we already have that narrative going. So that's really risky because we know that the child welfare system is not immune to systemic racism and tends to be overly punitive, and in the case of working with families of color, including Latinx families. And so what we're doing if we're sending this narrative about banning spanking is we're kind of perpetuating shame and stigma, when really what we want to do is bring parents to us to work together with us to talk about how hard it is to discipline kids and how to do that in the best, most effective way possible. So all of this coming together is risky, and it's also just fueling this mistrust and the stigma. It's certainly countering our efforts at collaboration, and it is reinforcing what I consider to be a deficit-oriented narrative. Okay, let me turn quickly to Latinx youth and what we've kind of learned about Latinx youth through our work. So stereotypically, I think these images to me represent what we tend to, what our narrative tends to be in the US about Latinx teenagers. And I want to start talking about this issue by reading a quote by Enrique. So remember, he is in his early 20s and he identifies as Mexican American. And he's here, this quote is about his time in high school, and actually throughout school, elementary school into high school. And he says, because of where we lived and how hard things were, I was told defending yourself and fighting back is the most important thing I could do from my family. More important than getting good grades or having perfect attendance. Fighting back is the most critical thing I could do. So that's how we tend to think of, I think in this country, of Latinx teenagers as kind of these fighters. Again, like if we look at media portrayals, for example, brown folks, brown young adult males tend to be criminals. They tend to be gang involved. But if we rewind and look at the early childhood period, we actually don't see a lot of evidence that acting out is an issue for this population. And in part, folks have kind of interpreted that as being consistent with this cultural value of buena educación. And so ser bien educado means to be well-mannered or to be well brought up. And so we certainly in our work, we're not finding very much evidence that mothers or teachers were saying that these kids were acting out more than we might expect given their age. Again, I want to kind of bring that back to perhaps this was the cultural emphasis within these communities on that, very well-mannered presentation, especially outside of the home. And here what you see in the image is also not only reference to being bien educado, but also how reinforcing this Latinx stereotype of, the way that parents achieve that is through harsh parenting, the use of the chancla. Okay, what we did find though, starting in early childhood, was high rates of internalizing problems. That was incredibly surprising for me. Here you see across 3 time points, pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade, boys, girls, and Mexican and Dominican American kids. This is the data from New York City. So there's about 750 kids here. And what you see is the percent of kids who were in the clinically elevated range based on mother report on the BASC. Now, this is not a diagnostic tool, so we're certainly not suggesting that nearly 50% of kids were clinically anxious, but these are pretty alarming rates, and they were pretty consistent over time, which was surprising. When the kids got
Esther, can you hear us? We seem to have lost you.
3, and the kids' self-report was pretty. We also found high rates of, there was terms of boys versus girls or Mexican versus Dominican American, but still we were surprised to see these rates. And then when we asked kids to tell us about depressive symptoms, and you see those listed in the bullet points on this slide, they reported much higher experiences of depressive symptoms than moms were reporting, right? And this is at the end of first grade. So this was pretty striking to us, and we wanted to understand more about and kind of dig deeper and get a more nuanced understanding about this early childhood mental health issue for these kids. These were kids that were not, from what we could tell, acting out, but they were internalizing a lot. And one way to understand that more is through this lens of intersectionality. So what you see here is a study that we did looking at gender and race differences to see if there were differences based on those social identities for these kids. This was data from the end of first grade and mother and teacher ratings. So this was kind of beginning to middle of first grade. And what we found was that ratings of anxiety, depression, hyperactivity, and aggression were all higher for Afro-Latina girls. So the Black girls in our study were being rated significantly higher than the others. And then when it came to the boys, the only rating that we saw higher based on race was ratings of aggression and by teachers. So I will note that here, when we start to do intersectionality analyses, it's tough because our sample size gets, our cell size gets pretty small. And so you see the ends on the top by group. And so we certainly do not want to overinterpret some of these findings because the Black subsample was relatively small. And still, it's pretty striking to look at some of these differences. And it fits entirely with the literature on teacher perceptions of Black children in particular. So we see that teachers actually rate kids as having more and more anxiety hyperactivity and aggression over time. So these are different teachers, of course, providing ratings across the years. But what we saw was kind of the sharp increase specific to Black kids that we weren't seeing for white kids. So that really makes me curious about the school experience for Latinx kids. And of course, this is part of the stereotype of Latinx youth, is that we're undereducated, that we don't even finish high school. Here you see kind of at a national level from NCES, like what are our graduation rates? And they are lower for what they're labeling as Hispanic students in the US. If we go back to the issue of intersectionality, we know that looks very different depending on what your social identities are. And that's because our social identities determine our social context. So even though, according to these stats, right, 75% of Latinx adults have completed high school, that also includes folks who have come to the US after their high school years, those rates drop depending on whether they're living in poverty, whether they're English language learners, and whether they're foreign born. We also know from the broader literature that the achievement gap emerges early, and that's especially true for certain subgroups, right? So we can't just say Latinx kids, but we want to understand Latinx kids within specific ecologies as defined by their country of origin as one example. So you see that those patterns of achievement in the lower right really look very different for kids who are Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Central American, South American, or other. Okay, so what did we find with our own data? Well, consistent with kind of the broader literature, we found that these kids entered school with some low levels of school readiness. So MA is Mexican origin, DA is Dominican origin. A third of Mexican origin kids were not, quote, school ready when they entered school. And 20% of Dominican origin kids were not school ready. So that's a pretty big difference between those two ethnic groups, and also pretty high for both groups. What we found then, and this was in using the Kaufman, so this was our own administered education or achievement test. In first grade, only 16% of Mexican origin kids and 22% of Dominican origin kids were not achieving at grade level. So what that tells us, right, if we can kind of connect some dots, we don't have empirical evidence of this, is that Mexican origin kids entered school and they actually, a lot of them caught up, right, which is what school is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to educate you. That was not the case for Dominican origin kids. By third grade, based on state test scores, 75% of Mexican origin kids, 67% of Dominican origin kids were not proficient in reading. Sorry, there's a not missing there on those bottom two bullet points. So I am going to repeat that in the form of this figure right here. 70% of kids in our sample of 750 Mexican and Dominican origin kids in New York City public schools were not proficient in reading or math. The math looks very similar. What you're looking at right here is the reading. And we wanted to understand if that looked different for kids of different identities. And there were some differences, right? Girls were doing a little bit better than boys. Dominican origin kids were doing a little bit better than Mexican origin. Spanish English speaking kids, in other words, kids who were exposed to English in the home, were doing better than kids whose family environment was Spanish only. And then a little bit of a hint that white kids were doing better than dark or Black kids. But overall, 70% of kids were not proficient by third grade. Drastically different than how they had entered school, drastically worse, right? And so this really, to me, speaks very directly to how the achievement gap that we talk about is an opportunity gap. There is a miseducation of kids happening in our school system because we can't reasonably argue that 70% of kids should not be learning at the level that they should be learning when we know that they were doing much better when they first entered school. And again, the purpose of school was to educate them. And so it reminds me of a quote by James Baldwin, which speaks to much more than the miseducation of Latinx kids. and it is about oppression, but education is indoctrination if you're white, subjugation if you're Black. And the idea really is that our school systems were designed for white kids. And even if historically speaking, that was the case, and we feel like that has changed, our school systems are still not serving to educate our kids, at least not based on this data. We know that there are a lot of kind of social contextual factors related to this. Here's a slide with the data out of Georgia. So these are early adolescents, that how mothers experience the school environment of their children in terms of discrimination is associated with how connected they feel with the school, what kinds of messages they send their kids about the importance of schooling, and that predicts GPA. We can also think about this case study with Enrique and how this is consistent with the data that we're seeing. He says, I then enrolled in a high school closer to the home we lived in. After about a month or two, I was called down to the office and met with a counselor who informed me I was being withdrawn and handed me my file. He asked that I leave the school property and referred an alternative charter school because, quote, they best served the type of student I was. There's a lot to unpack there, but I'm going to move on to another part of his story where he says, I enrolled at this alternative charter school and just thought of it as purgatory. One day I'm in class and a teacher calls me over and does something no one in my high school career had ever done. He spoke to me. He said I was smart, and how did I end up here? During my time in traditional public school, no teachers engaged with me. No teachers told me I was capable or smart. No teacher ever asked me what is going on or why am I missing so much. For 3 years in high school, I was ostracized and felt like a ghost. Teachers matter. We know that from the literature. Here is a study we did looking at the difference between Latinx teachers and non-Latinx teachers. And we found that of our kids, so these are the teachers of our Latinx kids in our study, these teachers who identified as Latinx were more culturally responsive. And that was associated with using what we consider more evidence-based strategies in the classroom around building relationship with kids, addressing their misbehavior, engaging with them, affirming their identities. Teachers matter. So with all of that, it leads me to this final question and commitment to prevention and early intervention, and a very strong sense that we're looking in all the wrong places. If we're focusing on moms and kids, are we looking in the right place? Are our moms and kids really the problem? And I don't think so, right? And it does remind me of this quote that I heard from scholar E.J. David, who said, the problem is not our resilience. David identifies as Filipino. The problem is not our resilience, but a world that constantly requires our resilience, a world that has come to learn that our resilience is permission for our continued oppression. That fits very clearly with eco-social theory. Eco-social theory was developed by Nancy Krieger to understand health disparities. And she argues that when we're looking at individual level data, we're really missing the picture. So she says, in capturing that point, she says, individual level data are more than simply individual, precisely because no one is an individual one day and a member of a population another. Each person is both simultaneously. And that's captured here in her figure on the eco-social theory, which has a lot going on. It's a very comprehensive and complex theory, but what it really emphasizes is that health disparities, which really are just the distribution of health across populations, are firmly situated within, right, this kind of triangle that you see of inequality that's determined by race, ethnicity, by gender, and by class. And that all of these experiences, right, are not only individually experienced and mediated, but also intergenerationally experienced and mediated. And so when we focus on the individual, we're really missing a lot of the complexity behind what's going on. So I will spend my last couple of minutes, if I'm doing okay on time, just saying a little bit about Parent Corps. And please feel free to stop me if I should wrap up now, but otherwise I will keep going. So Dr. Muffson mentioned Parent Corps in her introduction, and this is, like she said, it's a family-centered, school-based program for all kids as they enter pre-K, and it's really designed to be situated within schools that are under-resourced, or what Parent Corps calls historically disinvested neighborhoods and schools. And I want to name a couple of kind of the concepts behind Parent Corps. One is the concept of lifespan development. This is consistent with eco-social theory. We know that disadvantage accumulates over the lifespan, right? And so we want to emphasize supporting and addressing and mitigating these risk factors as early in life as possible. We also know that from a system dynamics perspective, psychopathology is something that's shaped over time, and that we go through these periods when kind of we're destabilized. For example, we enter the school system, we're destabilized in that, and then we kind of reorganize. And so those points of transition are an opportune time for intervention. And then I also want to name critical race theory, the highly contested critical race theory. Parent Corps believes that race is socially constructed, that racism is ordinary, believes in the idea of intersectionality, which I've talked about a lot today, believes in the idea of counter storytelling. In other words, we have to hear from folks who live these experiences in order to really address issues of race and racism, and critique of ahistoricism. Parent Corps was developed by us starting in 2000, I want to say. So it's been a while, but it's not a culturally adapted program per se. It was very heavily influenced by Incredible Years and PCIT and other EB parent training programs. But really, we took those concepts, and instead of going through that traditional cultural adaptation process, really, we just kind of were informed by those evidence-based programs and kind of engaged in a lot of processes to center culture as we developed Parent Corps. And so here's Parent Corps' theory of change. And we have three components: professional development, parenting program, and friends school. And we believe that through these programs and through what we call essential elements, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, that we can strengthen teacher-parent relationships, we can strengthen parent involvement in kids' learning, we can create safe, nurturing, and predictable environments for young kids, both at home and in the classroom, and we strengthen child social emotional learning. And all of those things cascade into more positive outcomes over time, not only for kids, but also for parents and for systems. So I want to end with just a little bit of conversation about these essential elements, because I do think that this is a way in which Parent Corps somewhat uniquely, although not entirely uniquely, really leans into eco-social theory and specifically into issues of racism. So the elements are building authentic relations. So that's about true collaboration. It leans into understanding race and racism, honoring culture. And these are very different things, because there are many programs that center culture and talk about cultural values and beliefs and traditions. And that's incredibly important. And that's also does not recognize the social hierarchies within which we're embedded, and specifically the racial and class and gender hierarchies. We certainly believe in science, and we share the science of early childhood development, although with some cautions, given the history of scientific racism. And the final essential element is practicing self-reflection. So as one example, what we do with schools is we're very clear that we believe that racism exists, and we engage in conversation about racism. And that's no small thing, because we are all socialized in this country to avoid discussions of race. We are silenced around race. Beverly Tatum talks about this, about how, when we're very young and curious and we kind of say something like, oh, that person looks different, or, their hair texture is different, or their skin color is so dark, that what we usually do is feel very uncomfortable and we silence kids, and kids learn that we don't bring those things up. And so it's really important, right, to learn how to talk about race. And part of the parent core process is engaging in that process, even as we're uncomfortable. And even as we're going to see things very differently, and we're also not going to solve the problem of racism. But we need to start by talking about it. So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to maybe skip here. I had a couple of slides just kind of describing how that plays out in our work with parents and in our work with teachers, but I'll skip ahead to a couple of final thoughts. One is, you know, in the process of developing parent core and in implementing parent core, which very much leaves room for, or actually not only leaves room, actually relies on a collaborative process where parents and teachers are as much experts as we are. There's this tension in these kinds of programs, especially when we want to rely on evidence-based programming between fidelity and fit. Guillermo Bernal is a leading scholar in cultural adaptation. And it's been interesting if you follow his work over time, how in some ways he has become more critical of kind of what we can and can't do in the cultural adaptation process. And one thing is that we feel so strongly that we know exactly that these evidence-based programs, how they work and why they work, and we really don't. And so when we're hanging our hat on fidelity and saying that that's more important than fit, we actually don't know that much about what those core elements are, what the sequencing is, what those underlying mechanisms are. And then another point I want to make is that, you know, we really want to challenge how our evidence-based programs in many ways reinforce whiteness. So here's a quote by Gon, who says, "By virtue of their own cultural assumptions and expectations, these interventions may well purchase amelioration of symptoms or improvement in functioning at the expense of tacit Western cultural assimilation." So in other words, right, these programs, while evidence-based, have been developed for, by, within, like very steeped in whiteness, and they reinforce whiteness. And so this is a form in some ways, or at least we need to wonder, in which ways are we actually engaging in professional imperialism? So in Parent Core, our goal really is to counter some of those things, certainly to bring awareness of those things through these values of autonomy, collaboration, community, culture, equity, and evidence. And I will end there. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to discussion, any questions you may have.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Calzada. We do have several questions that we'll get to in a second, and also lots of comments of folks saying what a tremendous talk. So thank you very much. So our first question today comes from Dr. Amy Margolis. So Amy, you can unmute yourself as well and then ask the question to our speaker.
Hi, and thank you, Dr. Calzada, for just a really brilliant talk. That was amazing. I have a thought and a question. The thought was to say, I'm so impressed by the work overall. The breadth of your work is inspiring, and also how you wove in qualitative research with quantitative research was so elegant, and I think a real model for all of us to try and do in our work as we try to get these top-tier journals to include more qualitative perspectives, because we're not going to understand or move forward in our research without those perspectives. And that kind of research is just not part of the zeitgeist, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. We absolutely.
So I was just really blown away, actually. And in terms of a question, I mean, I have many. I study learning problems and maybe learning disabilities, but I try to characterize them as learning problems because, as you're pointing out, we can't diagnose these kids based on what we see, and rates of diagnosis are so complicated in these populations of kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds or immigrant backgrounds. And I guess I'm wondering how you see parenting relating to some of the learning outcomes, particularly around research and moving forward, and how can we redesign schools to include, you know, what we need parents, well, how do we educate parents and include them in their kids' education and make schools that are designed for the kids we see now? Obviously, there were kids who were here before too, when we had this imperialist, colonialist regime that designed the schools we're going to. So I don't know if that's too broad or too hard, but I guess either in the research or the clinical practice domain, like how do you see, what are some of the dreams or ideas of how we could move forward there?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. It's a little bit of a dream of mine to envision a redesigned school system. I think about education justice, right? And that idea is essentially that schools should be designed for, with, by folks who are attending those schools. And if we think of Latinx students, what does that look like? That looks like affirming spaces. And we know that kids and families are being marginalized, pushed to the side in so many both implicit and explicit ways within the school system. So what might that look like? I think that one, our idea of what education is a little bit flawed, right? So we're starting school at age 4. You know, we know that education and the development of the mind starts at birth. And so how can we think about those 0 to 3 years when these families have so much richness, right? And so many strengths and are so committed to their kids. And how can we work with these communities to think about language development, for example, and cognitive stimulation more broadly in the 0 to 3 years? So I would say we're starting even before that traditional school entry. You know, school entry in an environment that historically has punished you for speaking your home language, that requires parents, if they want to visit their child's teacher, to show ID, and lots of folks don't have ID, or requires you to come during your work hours and you can't afford to miss work. Like, all of those very practical barriers need to be, I think, completely rethought, right? And then I think fundamentally, right, our teaching force does not match who our kids are. And our training doesn't help, right? Doesn't prepare teachers. So I'm not bashing teachers at all. I think teachers are sheroes in so many ways. They have a really, really tough job. They're also not prepared. They work in really tough circumstances. And so if we want to, if you think about, for example, Prudence Carter arguing that the achievement gap is an opportunity gap, that's because it's no coincidence that the kids who are, quote, underachieving are from the schools that have no resources, right? They do not have bilingual programming. They don't have AP classes as the kids get. They don't have libraries. They don't have gyms. They don't have, you know, chess club, like all of these different levels, right? And then we layer on top, like, we know that teachers have these implicit biases because we all do societally. So that's a lot, nothing very concrete, but I guess the reimagining for me is really kind of starting to think about a system that if we truly were committed to education, then we are committed to the humanity and the brilliance. We have to assume the brilliance of each child. And how do we bring out the brilliance of each child? And kids can be brilliant when they have learning disorders, and kids are brilliant when they, right? So, but a lot of that is just, that's not how we think, and that's not how we function. And fundamentally, that's, in my opinion, both a reflection of racism and of our priorities when it comes to financial investments. So that was pretty general, but some off the cuff.
That was great, because that was a pretty big question from Amy. So thank you very much. And our next question is from Coriana Seychelles, and she is a postdoctoral fellow here at Columbia.
Hi, Coriana.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I really admired the breadth of that talk and how you, started us out with little people and brought us to bigger people. And I think the grace with which you did that was amazing and gave me a lot to think about. And I'm particularly interested in adolescence. And so I think one of the things that I find myself thinking a lot about is how we focus on families when kids are little, and for a good reason, but that family also is an important context.
I'm not sure if it's on my end, but I can't hear you.
We
lost her a little.
Diana, we lost you a little, but you started asking your question and then we lost you. Can you
hear me?
We can now.
Okay, sorry about that. So I guess I was just wondering if you could talk about supporting parents beyond those early childhood years and families beyond those early childhood years, acknowledging that school is a really important context, but that's not the only context that kids are living in. And this is a really, unique kind of area for these kids to straddle between the home and the school. So really focusing on the family and the home.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I definitely consider myself an early childhood person, so I'll do the best I can. Adolescents are a little bit of a foreign concept to me, except for my own. But I have been collaborating, like I said, with Katie Roche on understanding some of these processes with Latinx families of adolescents. I think that a really important angle into the work with Latinx families during the adolescent developmental phase is around, this is often a time where really that clash between cultures comes up, right? And this is the accumulation of kids being socialized, right, outside of the home to speak English and to white norms, and within these immigrant homes to speak Spanish, and often parents are only Spanish speaking, and to Latinx norms. And the language brokering, right? That role that kids are put in where they have to translate for their parents. That's one really important issue as kids get older and more is required of them, including in the school system, right? And so you are translating what your teacher, your guidance counselor is saying to your parent about you, right? That's incredibly complicated. On top of that, right, you are starting to say, well, my friends are doing X, Y, and Z, and I want to do X, Y, and Z. And that is not necessarily aligned with the values or the expectations of your immigrant parents. This is a great opportunity. And there's some work around kind of bicultural family interventions around like, let's normalize what your kids are asking for. They're not being disrespectful. They're not like wanting to get away from you, but let's kind of talk about that context for kids. Let's talk about the context within the home and how do we kind of help bridge those worlds. And the connection to school, I think, is very salient because it does include, there's some literature that suggests for Latinx parents, schooling is the purview of teachers and administrators. It's not your purview. Like even the idea that you would go and like have a parent-teacher conference can be inconsistent with this idea, right? I'm letting you do your job. And so you can imagine the parent involvement is a little bit different and when you have those beliefs. And then of course, there are all the ways in which schools may or may not be welcoming of parents for that parent involvement. So what would parent involvement look like? What are those things that Latinx parents would feel are the important things to do in order to keep their kids invested and connected with the educational process? One thing the literature is starting to show is that you don't need to show up in the school building. Parent involvement is more than showing up in the school building. It's the messaging that you're giving at home. It's the asking whether the homework was done. If you think about the education levels of many immigrant parents from Central American countries as an example, these are folks who didn't have the opportunity for formal education, and often education stops at 3rd or 6th grade. So now that also, right, as kids get older, you become more and more uncomfortable with the idea of supporting learning because you haven't learned that. So how do you support it? So there's so many things to tackle there, but I think it starts with kind of challenging the expectations we have for what it needs to look like for parents to support their kids' education, Because one thing that's very clear is also many families are here so that their kids will succeed in school. So that motivation and that commitment's there. Now, how it plays out, right? If that motivation's there, how it plays out seems to be largely a function of these systemic barriers and these cultural misalignments.
Thank you. So now switching gears a little bit from sort of the school domain, now thinking clinically, we have a question here that I'm going to read from Dr. Deborah Kamenis, who says, thank you for your fascinating talk. As a person who trains providers who see adults, I'd be interested in whether there are materials that help providers of adults to learn to ask clients or patients about their parenting styles in ways that do not reinforce bias and that are culturally sensitive.
So I will say, and especially this semester when I'm teaching anti-racist research methods, all of our methods are biased. Certainly all of our assessment tools are biased. And that, certainly I'm saying there's some limitations with that, but also we need to understand that that's just inevitable. Somebody who creates a thing, it's going to be biased according to that person's perspective, right? Now it happens to be within the context also of kind of this history of scientific racism and all of these other things. But that aside, yes, our assessment tools are biased. I think the opportunity for people to tell their stories about parenting is probably, off the top of my head, what I would say, the way to get the most affirming, I guess, most affirming approach to letting folks talk about their own histories of parenting, if I understood the question correctly. So otherwise, we are buying into kind of what are, on many levels, theoretically on parenting, what are the indicators of parenting, and what do those indicators, so like what do you do, right? Very descriptively. I play with my child. Well, you're assuming, right, that the worldview with their kids. So already in the kind of items that you ask about in any of these measures, there's some bias. And then they also, the way that we then group the items together to say, well, this is an indication of X type of parenting is also very grounded, right, in the theories that we have, which are very Westernized. So I would say that if, I don't know that my experience is that those feel that they feel like it feels like a negative experience to Latina mothers in my case to complete those measures. I think there's enough familiarity and it's not a negative experience if I think clinically, but I think that it misses a lot. And if your goal is just to really get a more accurate understanding, I would say you ask and listen, right, in a more kind of qualitative methods approach. And the problem with that, we talked about that a little bit, is many problems with qualitative research methods in the academy, but one is certainly that we often don't have the luxury of time.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to read one more question, and then I think just in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to ask perhaps the final question, and Blair if she has closing comments. So this question comes from Justin Rue. And he notes, do you feel that harsh parenting also contributes from or comes from the trauma that mothers themselves may have gone through? So thinking about that intergenerational piece there. Yes.
So I'm pausing mostly because by virtue of my data collection approach and my sampling strategies and where I was, I have had a very specific, right, type of sample, which is, which brings to mind less those traumatic experiences. Now that I'm in Texas, actually, right, it is much more salient to think about these moms who have experienced really severe traumas, both in their country of origin and in their migration journey. That felt much less salient in New York City and even in Corpus Christi, actually. So really, it's quite unique. And that's all to say that I have less kind of familiarity and kind of understanding of those traumatic histories. But I have done a little bit of work, mostly through my students, to understand kind of the ways in which these trauma histories impact parenting. And of course, we know, right, that traumatic events live with you, stay with you, and that shapes then your experiences and your approach to parenting. So I guess it's not a very necessarily good answer, but I would just affirm that I think that piece is really, really important. And I think that when we're taught with violence, right, then that's often how we know how to respond to others. And certainly parenting is a very taxing experience, and that's when these kind of impulses tend to come out.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and we'll have final comments.
This was such an amazing talk. Thank you, Esther. I could think of so many other things I would want to have you come back and talk more about. But what struck me from your talk is really highlighting the societal components, the racist approach, the westernized approach in education, and how that perpetuates so many of the problems of our Latinx youth in schools and their mental health, and thinking about how Parent Corps targets these kids and the families and the schools at such a young age. And I could see that there's a need to continue to do that in the later school years, particularly, you know, working with adolescents, and I'm working with Black and Latinx youth in the New York City schools, and seeing so much of this still exists, and the connection with schools, and how we can make them a more welcoming and supportive place for these youth. And is anybody thinking about how to translate the Parent Corps piece into something that can be used in the upper grades? Because I think some of this work needs to continue with teachers, not to mention, you know, we've talked for so many years about bringing evidence-based training into graduate schools in psychology. I could see the need, you know, we need to bring these curriculum issues and bring this knowledge that you've been collecting into schools of education, so that we don't have to educate the teachers after they've already gotten their teaching degrees, but to embed it in teacher training. And I just wondered your thoughts on what you know is happening.
Nothing. So that's the short answer. And you know, I've never thought of that. I don't think that the Parent Corps team more broadly has thought about that, although I'm not in daily contact with them anymore. It's a great idea. We tend to think of Parent Corps so developmentally specific, and that really is simply because of the parenting program and Friends School piece, which was like the curriculum right around building foundational SEL skills. What has been really emphasized, added, augmented over time is this piece of working with the system. And that there's no reason that piece could not be scaled to older grades. Yeah, I love that idea.
We'll have to talk.
I was about to say, I think that's the collaboration.
The seed of a collaboration.
Live on Zoom. Well, thank you so much. Dr. Calzada. Dr. Simpson unfortunately had to run. She had a call, so I'm just going to read her comments, but she said, thank you so much for such an important talk, demonstrating many things, including the value of data to challenge assumptions and better guide policy, and the need for educational justice, and the importance of using both our professional and personal experiences to guide our work. So thank you very much. And then also we just want to give another shout out to Dr. Bradford for her admission to the Academy. That's excellent. Thank you, everybody. And remember, next week, for those who are interested, we will be live and in person in the auditorium, masks and socially distanced. Okay, thanks very much. Bye, everybody.